Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. My name is Yuval Shani. I'm the academic director of the Minerva Center for Human Rights. Let me say a few words about the center and then about tonight's program. The center is an academic research center which is based at the Hebrew University. It deals mainly with academic research and the promotion of academic events in the field of human rights, but it also is engaged in a number of other programs, including an educational program where we teach students about human rights. We also have some more clinical-oriented programs, and in fact we have a group of 11 students from the US who are participating in one of these clinical programs and are here with us this afternoon. And we also seek to establish or to facilitate some sort of dialogue about human rights issues between different elements within the Israeli society and elements from outside the Israeli society. And in fact, what we are meeting here for is an event which wraps up a two-day workshop which we organized on the topic of human rights defenders, which we have organized in cooperation with the Royal Norwegian Embassy in Israel and with the help of some other groups, and most prominently an NGO called Frontline, whose two representatives are here as well, Mary Lawler and Andrew Anderson. And we thank very much our partners for helping us with this event. I'll tell you I'll say a few sentences about the event, and then we'll move on to the other speakers of the evening. The workshop was designed to look more closely at the concept of human rights defenders. The concept human rights defenders has won international recognition in 1998 when the General Assembly had passed a resolution on the rights and responsibilities of human rights defenders. And that resolution has led to growing awareness to the special need to protect human rights defenders. And in 2000, the Secretary General of the UN has appointed a special representative to work on human rights defender, and this is Ms. Jilani here, who will be delivering the keynote presentation this afternoon. So the purpose of the workshop was to study the concept of human rights defenders and to look at its application to the situation here in Israel and at the occupied territories. I should say that we've encountered during the preparations for this workshop a lot of difficulties, and they may be in a very small way, they may be illustrative of some of the difficulties which real human rights defenders face. We try to bring in human rights defenders from the occupied territories, from Gaza and the West Bank, but the people on whose behalf we requested to come were denied entry to Jerusalem and to Israel. We also tried to get the IDF to participate in this workshop, and the IDF spokesperson's office also refused to allow IDF personnel to participate. So at the end of the day, the workshop was basically comprised of local NGOs here in Israel, some academics, and our international guests. And I think, notwithstanding these less than ideal conditions, we did have very interesting discussions which clarified, at least to me, some of the concepts, the key concepts, but also some of the main issues, and hopefully we will be able to hear more about this later on. So I would now like to ask Ms. Lena Lind, the Deputy Ambassador of the Royal Norwegian Embassy, who's been really the driving force behind this workshop, to say a few words, and then we'll move on to the keynote presentation by Ms. Jilani.
It's my pleasure and privilege, I would like to say, to welcome you all to this lecture. And it also a privilege for the Norwegian Embassy to have been associated with the Minerva Center for Human Rights and Frontline, another partner organization, to organize this event. We, as an embassy and my government, take a special interest in this issue because Norway chaired the working group at the United Nations that developed the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And I'm sure Mrs. Jilani, who will lecture you on this later, will talk more about that, but it took us 13 years of negotiations at the United Nations to arrive at a consensus declaration on human rights defenders. And that one was finally adopted in 1998 by the UN General Assembly. And this was really a historic achievement because it was the first UN instrument to recognize the importance and the legitimacy of the work of human rights defenders, as well as their need for better protection. And as Yuval also said, following the adoption of the declaration, there was the establishment of the mandate of the Special Representative on the situation of human rights defenders. And the first holder of this mandate was Mrs. Hina Jilani, who really has been the driving force in shaping and defining the content of this concept. We as a government are very pleased to note that the mandate was renewed at the Human Rights Council deliberations in Geneva last year, and a special rapporteur, which is the new title, has been decided upon and will continue this work for at least another 3 years. So, as mentioned in the title for this lecture, we've had the declaration for 10 years, since last year. And we believe as a government that this declaration has provided recognition of human rights defenders and increased their visibility. It has promoted the establishment of mechanisms for their protection, and thanks to the work of the Special Rapporteur, we now know more about the situation of human rights, such as the impact of security legislation, the role in emergencies, and their role in peace processes and countries in transition. We also know more about how restrictions on freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly affect their work. Over the last 10 years, it's also our observation that we have seen the establishment and strengthening of networks and coalitions on human rights defenders and regional mechanisms, and joint efforts have brought more of the problems facing the defenders to light. For example, we have been made aware of the situation of defenders who enjoy less protection or are more at risk, such as defenders working on economic, social and cultural rights, women defenders, and those defending the rights of lesbians, gays and bisexuals and transgender persons. Still, 10 years after the adoption of the declaration, the number of attacks on human rights defenders is increasing dramatically. Defenders in many parts of the world continue to be victims of assassinations, disappearances, arbitrary detention, torture, death threats, and different forms of harassment. And the responsible of such attacks often enjoy complete impunity. Added to this are vilification campaigns and negative propaganda that stigmatizes defenders and subversive elements of society and sometimes criminalizes them. We therefore continue to believe, and we had made it a priority for all Norwegian embassies worldwide, to try to promote and spread knowledge about the concept of human rights defenders. And it is with this background that we are very pleased and very grateful to Mrs. Hina Jilani to have taken the long trip from Pakistan to Israel to talk to all of you about her work as the Special Representative to the Secretary General on the situation of human rights defenders. So welcome, and please.
Before introducing Ms. Jilani, just a couple of thank yous. I want to thank the staff of Minerva for putting this together, to Advocate Dani Evron, and to Anat, and Merav, and Alon, who have been working behind the scenes to make everything happen, like always. I also want to thank the five chairs, the four chairs. Dani was also one of the chairs of the workshop for their contribution. Dr. Daphna Golan, who's heading our clinical programs, Professor David Kretschmer, who's a member of our advisory board, Advocate Eitan Diamond from the ICRC, who's been also a long-standing partner of ours, and especially I want to thank Ms. Simona Halprin from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that was very helpful and very instrumental in putting this workshop together. And now I want to introduce to you very briefly the speaker for this evening, briefly not because I couldn't stand and talk for many minutes about her very impressive record, but I think it would be, I don't want to delay the presentation too much. Ms. Jilani, as you've heard, has been the first special representative to the Secretary General who is dealing with human rights defenders and has a lot of credit for the expansion and the growing acceptability of the term. Before that, she worked in Pakistan as a lawyer, opened the first all-women law firm in Pakistan, worked on women's rights, on children's rights, in minorities' rights, in prisoners' rights, in an environment where human rights defenders are encountering real difficulties. She's an advocate of the Supreme Court of Pakistan, founder of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, and as we have experienced already in the workshop, is an extremely knowledgeable person about human rights defenders, and also very, I found her interventions and presentations in the workshop to be highly inspirational. And I'm sure that we are going to appreciate a very impressive lecture this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all say that it's a great privilege to be back in this region. I was here 4 years ago, and I thank the Minerva Center for Human Rights for giving me this opportunity and to speaking about not just human rights defenders from my experience as a special representative and a mandate holder of the United Nations, but addressing these concerns from my position as a human rights defender myself. And much of what I will say today really comes from my 35 years experience of working as a human rights defender in one of the worst environments for the promotion and protection of human rights. I say that the environment that I worked in was not so good, with a full consciousness that human rights defenders anywhere in the world are neither safe nor have the adequate facilities in order to be able to defend human rights. We just heard that it took the international community, the United Nations, to adopt, it took them 13 years to adopt the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. What is of more relevance is not just the fact that it took us 13 years to get there, but also we must understand and pay full attention to the reasons for the adoption of this declaration. Why did it become important? Firstly, of course, the obvious reason was that human rights defenders all over the world were experiencing harm and persecution to an extent where it became a matter of grave concern to the international community, especially the international community within the United Nations system that has been engaged with and preoccupied with creating and setting norms and standards of human rights for several decades now. The work of the international community and organizations such as the United Nations doesn't stop at standard setting. these standards have to be implemented. And the implementation of these standards has to be tested with respect to the impact that this implementation has on the respect for human rights, on the one hand, and on the tools that are provided in the process of standard setting to those who are willing to risk their lives, their liberty, and their credibility in order to defend and promote human rights. This declaration has become one of those tools. It took 13 years to arrive at a consensus text for the declaration. But what is also important to remember is that it was adopted by consensus, which means that member states of the United Nations who were sitting in the General Assembly that adopted this document gave their moral commitment to uphold the principles that the declaration put forward. The declaration, I must state, is just the beginning for the protection of human rights defenders. It is a beginning that must take us through a process whereby we set the rules for the protection of human rights defenders. We also understand what their work entails and what is the responsibility of states and governments in order to ensure that human rights defenders conduct these activities not just with safety but also with facility. The substance of the declaration is very important because it creates a framework for not just the duty of the states for the protection of human rights, but it creates a framework of responsibility of the civil society as well. This is the first human rights document in the United Nations human rights system that not just speaks about the rights of human rights defenders, but also the responsibility of the civil society to promote and protect human rights. So when the rights of human rights defenders are being violated, we must also remember that these violations in fact imply that human rights defenders are being obstructed in the fulfillment of their responsibility as envisaged in the declaration. The declaration, in the first place, addresses the needs not just of individuals to protect human rights, but those of collective entities like associations, organizations. So it's very important to understand that the declaration has very clearly given legitimacy to collective activity for the promotion and protection of human rights. Secondly, it just doesn't stop at saying that they have a right to defend human rights. It also says that it is the primary responsibility of the state to ensure that conditions exist politically, economically, and socially, which will enable this category of persons to undertake action and activities for the protection and promotion of human rights. If you go through the declaration, you will notice that many of the rights that the declaration mentions are already existing in different human rights conventions. The freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of information, the freedom of movement, the freedom of assembly. These are already protected in different conventions. But in the context of the declaration, these rights have a special connotation. Through these rights, the Declaration seeks to point out the activities and the functions and the role of human rights defenders. Collectively, these rights signify and indicate that human rights defenders have a role in advocating human rights issues. They have a role in monitoring situations in order to detect violations, and they have a role to report violations in order that the relevant actors and stakeholders are able not just to identify the violations, but also to address them. One of the important rights that the Declaration mentions, and which was one of the contentious issues also in the negotiation of the Declaration, is Article 7 of the Declaration, which says that it is the right of everyone to advocate new human rights ideas and to work for the adoption of new human rights ideas. And I say this particularly because Lene mentioned the rights of the lesbian, gay communities in different parts of the world. When violations against those who were seeking to enforce the rights to physical integrity of these communities were taken up under my mandate or any other mandate, they were viciously attacked by many members of the United Nations. And this article came to our rescue. Their argument was, none of the instruments recognizes these specific rights. So how can you raise them at the forum like United Nations under a mandate that this organization has given you? And our answer then was a resort to this article of the Declaration. And I'm happy to say that my colleagues in the United Nations recognized even more the significance of this declaration and its importance to all our work, not just the work of human rights defenders, but also the different mandates that are overseeing the implementation of other conventions of the United Nations. We all know from the work that we do, because this is a gathering of human rights defenders, that the nature of our work differs, just as the context in which we work differs. Human rights defenders work in peacetime, doing their work of advocacy, doing their work of monitoring, doing their work of promoting and evolving the better methods and more means of implementations of the recognized human rights and fundamental freedoms. In times of conflict, these defenders have become the first sign of warning that a situation is emerging. We have seen from examples, for instance, in Rwanda and other countries where situations were emerging. Human rights defenders, in fact, were the first ones to point out what would result from the extreme nature of the violations that had already started to occur. And this is an acknowledged fact that human rights defenders not work just for peace and security, but they have become an important instrument of early warning of situations emerging which not just the country in question, but the whole international community has to deal with. So, human rights defenders, when they are working individually, the impact of their work is accumulative. But at the same time, as I said earlier, collective activity is absolutely an essence and a basis for the work of human rights defenders. One of the collective expressions is the right to protest. And the Declaration very clearly preserves and protects this right and activities that are an expression of collective protest. The Declaration talks about the right to react and oppose human rights violations. The Declaration says that when such activity is conducted, those who are engaged in this activity are protected against any adverse action from the state. The Declaration also makes it incumbent upon the state to ensure that any violation of those who are defending human rights results in appropriate action against the perpetrators, whether it is the state itself or others who are non-state actors. It is the tendency of states to avoid responsibility or accountability when there are non-state actors involved and just shrug their shoulders to say, we didn't do it. International law is very clear on this. Where the state is not directly involved in a human rights violation, it is a clear and unambiguous responsibility of the state to hold those persons accountable. Failure of the state in this respect then casts a doubt as to the state's commitment to deal with human rights violations. And I think many of you are familiar with a case law of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, where the Rodriguez case, where they said involvement of non-state actors and failure of the state to hold them accountable does not absolve a state from its responsibility. By implication, the state has condoned that violation. It is the collective conscience of the world recognized that human rights cannot be promoted and protected unless and until we are willing and are committed to protecting the whole activity of defending human rights. And that is how this whole category of human rights defenders emerged. The Declaration doesn't mention the word human rights defenders even once. The Declaration does not attempt to define who is a human rights defender. The Declaration emphasizes the activities that are essential for promoting and protecting human rights. Those who undertake these activities are engaged with these activities, be they individuals or associations, they are human rights defenders. When I took over this mandate and I was appointed as the special representative of the Secretary General to implement the mandate, I was under a great deal of pressure by states and governments to define what a human rights defender is. I had to resist the temptation myself to define who a human rights defender is. And I must say my instinct as a lawyer came in handy at that time. By defining who a human rights defender is, we would have allowed the scope for exclusion of many who deserved the protection of the Declaration. By insisting that it is the activity which must determine whether a person who undertook that activity was a human rights defender or not. Therefore, a working definition for my mandate was anyone who takes any action or engages in any activity for the protection or promotion of any of the fundamental rights and fundamental freedoms and human rights is a human rights defender. That allowed me to take up cases of a diverse category of people who were actually promoting and protecting human rights, but were doing that in different capacities. They may have been NGOs, they may have been participants of any of the political or social movements, they may have been civil servants, health professionals, leaders of communities, lawyers, journalists, and just an analysis of the action they took made it easy for us to identify them as human rights defenders and to insist that they are entitled to the protection of the principles set forward in the Declaration. Now, why did the international community adopt this declaration? Because most of the human rights action takes place at national levels. And many of the violations also occur at national levels. This act of the international community within the United Nations endorsed the view that human rights transcend beyond borders and is a legitimate concern of the human rights community and the international community the world over. Human rights defenders must enjoy the support and solidarity of the global community that endorses and subscribes to the international human rights framework. I know that there are many times in our national and local contexts where we desperately need this solidarity. When freedom of expression, freedom of movement, and freedom of assembly make it impossible for us to get the required public support within our countries. We have been in situations, I myself personally, on the issue of women's human rights, where actions of the state not just resulted in discrimination of a serious nature against women and the legislation of laws that openly discriminated against women and reduced their legal status, but social policies adopted by the state paved the way for social discrimination. And our lack of freedoms made it extremely difficult for us to inform public opinion of the injustices of such actions. Our support came from the international public opinion, and we benefited from it. That's why it is absolutely important that the international community keeps an eye on human rights situations and has the ability to monitor the situation in every part of the world. And this is how the Declaration became an instrument for the United Nations. And the mandate that I held for 8 years was created. I had the global mandate not just to receive information, but to seek information on the situation of human rights defenders and to respond to that information. Responding to that information meant that I had to take action. The first step of that action would be to communicate concern to governments regarding human rights violations when they affected the ability of human rights defenders to promote and defend human rights. This particular instrument also has another significance. We have always thought of the international community as a notion that applies to states. There is no notion of a concept of an international community without the inclusion of the civil society as a part of that international community. So whereas the UN may be an intergovernmental organization, the human rights system of that organization has gradually come to accept and recognize that the international community engaged with the issues of human rights includes the civil society. And that is why the Declaration speaks about the responsibility of the civil society to promote and protect human rights. As you can see, the conference that I came here to attend was meant to deliberate on the situation of human rights defenders in Israel and the human rights defenders in the occupied territory. I regret, and so all the participants of this conference are agreed, that we are extremely disappointed that the very freedoms about which we are talking about were taken away from Palestinian human rights defenders working in the occupied territory. And they were not able to participate in this conference, deliberations of which were so relevant to their work. I draw the attention also of this audience that it was a matter of great disappointment for us. We cannot discuss the difficulties that these defenders face without their being a part of this discussion and having the opportunity of pinpointing the degree to which their work is obstructed and the difficulties that they face. In fact, the word difficulty may be a euphemism in connection with the problems that these people confront. And that is why it is so important that we not just think and speak about what they undergo, but also to have the opportunity of listening to them at first hand. I have always felt that it is very difficult to assess the situation of human rights defenders without looking at the human rights background and the whole context of human rights situations which they are attempting to deal with. I held an official visit to this region in 2005 at the invitation of the government of Israel, and by the courtesy of the Palestinian National Authority, I was able to visit the West Bank and to talk to human rights defenders there and talk to human rights defenders in Israel. I can tell you that if I had ignored the context, my assessment would have been a very poor assessment. I say this because I have heard many times that this argument that let us just restrict ourselves to the difficulties of human rights defenders. I ask you, how do we assess the difficulties that human rights defenders face without assessing the human rights situation that places them in that situation of difficulty? How do we address those difficulties without addressing the situations from which these difficulties emerge? It therefore became very necessary for me at the time that I was conducting this mission, because I had to make a report of this and report my assessment to the Human Rights Commission as it was at that time. I had the opportunity of meeting with human rights defenders inside Israel, made myself familiar with their situation, had the opportunity of talking to the government here. And while I can't say that their situation was ideal, I detected that in many areas, human rights defenders have the opportunity of undertaking activities and carrying out their work with a reasonable amount of safety and facility. These defenders acknowledged that they were able to address the legislature if they were advocating law reform. Many of them had been a part of drafting laws. However, when I dug a little deeper, I realized that even for human rights defenders in Israel, there are several areas in which they face difficulties. For instance, I felt that there were different levels of treatment and the manner of response by government to human rights defenders, depending on the nature of their activity and nature of their concerns and the area of human rights in which they were engaged, especially with regard to their concerns on minority rights issues. The level of response was certainly different, and the commitment of the government to facilitate their activities was certainly not uniform. I also realized that one of the gravest problems for the human rights defenders here was when they were speaking or addressing the human rights of the Palestinian population under occupation. These defenders faced harassment. These defenders faced marginalization. And there were several attempts by state and non-state actors to undermine their credibility in different ways. But my biggest concern when I was in the region stemmed, and I think that understandably so, and you would agree with me, my biggest concerns stemmed from the way that human rights defenders working in the occupied territory were prevented from the work that they did. And I heard credible reports of the different kinds of violations to which they were subjected. Killings, arbitrary arrest and detention, continuous intimidation and harassment, lack of freedom of movement because of the several barriers that were put there, undermining of their credibility, deliberate attempts to attack their status as human rights defenders, vilification campaigns against them and the organizations they worked with. I would like to say, and I don't want to hurt anybody's sensitivities, that I had always thought that I was very well informed about the situation of the Palestinian population and the difficulties of the human rights defenders here. And I said this at the end of my mission. I was absolutely taken aback at the degree to which international norms and standards were not only flouted, they were flouted in a very blatant manner. It was not that many of these violations occurred because agencies of the state were not aware of these violations, but there was an attempt to justify these violations on a repeated emphasis on security. I never denied that there was an absolute need for security. I recognize the duty of the state to protect. In fact, as human rights defenders, we have insisted on the duty of the state to protect. I come from a country where security concerns are just as acute. So I am not unaware of the dangers that come from violence, whether it is political violence or terrorism. Human rights defenders like myself have been in the front line against these trends much before security became a global preoccupation. People who believe in tolerance, who believe in the rights of women, who believe in promotion of values of accommodation, have been the first ones to warn against extremism of any kind, whether it's religious extremism, it's ultranationalism, or any phenomenon that reduces tolerance. Yet we are the first ones to say that it is wrong to presume and assume that security and human rights are opposing factors. This false tension between security and human rights is absolutely unjustified. Human rights framework was constructed after the Second World War. The human rights framework is well aware of extraordinary situations and caters for these. Nevertheless, human rights framework insists that there are limitations that can be placed on rights, but these limitations and the procedures and processes for placing such limitations and derogation of rights is well spelt also, and that any such measures must be undertaken within that framework. The human rights framework has sufficient capacity to accommodate security. It is therefore that we have insisted that security imperatives must be served within the human rights framework and the rule of law and not outside of it. And this applies to all situations, whether it is counterterrorism or it is conduct of states with regard to the situations that emerge at the national level, whether it is internal conflict, or it is international conflict, or a situation of occupation, human rights and international humanitarian law has adequate capacity to deal with these situations. And I felt that in this context, it was not just Palestinian human rights defenders, but also Israeli human rights defenders who talk about the practices of the occupation and the violations that occur as a consequence of such practices. They suffer as well, because within their societies, not just state elements, but also non-state elements, have found a free field to undermine their credibility. Occupation in itself is a violation of human rights, and I endorse the very strong views of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Palestine, who has very clearly given the legal framework of conduct of states where there is a situation of occupation. I also felt that there were several areas of human rights within Israel and trends that were emerging, which got subsumed by the whole question of occupation and the gross violations occurring because of the practices of the occupation. I tried to paint a comprehensive picture in my report. I appreciated the democratic dispensation in Israel and the merits of its institutions. But juxtaposed with the situation that I assessed in relation to the occupation, I had to say in my report that the merits of the value of Israel's democracy and the merits of its institution are overshadowed by the situation that has occurred in this region because of the occupation and the practices of the occupation that are resulting in gross human rights violations. Now, many people feel that it is unjustified on the part of the global community or Israeli human rights defenders to allow the occupation to overshadow either the merits of the Israeli democracy and the strengths of its institutions, or to allow other human rights situations to be neglected here. And I have heard many times that why are you talking about Palestinian rights? Why don't you talk about this, that, or the other right? Fine. I think that instead of thinking that this is a default on the part of human rights defenders because they are preoccupied with the situation that is occurring, they should understand that this is just another problem of the occupation. This is another harm that the occupation is doing. This harm is being done to the state of Israel, where the values of democracy and the commitment to values that you hold precious is becoming hollow. These are being eroded every day. It is the direct consequence of the occupation that this eventuality is being neglected, and it is affecting the strength of your institutions as well as making democracy in this state weaker and weaker. Believe me, many of us in the human rights field are concerned about this, because the ultimate result of our work, that of defending human rights, is meant to strengthen democracy, because it is under democratic dispensations that human rights can best be promoted. It is the ultimate objective of our work to preserve values of justice. We have an interest in preserving democracy, justice, and therefore we are concerned about it. Nevertheless, we feel that the kind of violations that we hear about or see in this region, because of the consequences of the occupation, that not only result in injustice, it results in the denial of the very human right which becomes the core human right, and that is the value of human dignity. I appreciate many things that have been achieved by this country. But at the same time, I believe that the other face of Israel is such that I am constrained and compelled to say, from my experiences, that the loss of dignity, the violation of the right to dignity that I have witnessed here at every checkpoint, I must say that an average Palestinian has shown remarkable restraint in the face of that violation. I would like to end here by saying that the international community wants to support every effort to change the situation, which is resulting in harm both to the Israelis, citizens, and to the Palestinians. Human rights violations have the very visible effect of eroding values. The longer they are allowed to prevail, the greater the risks to everything that we value, both as citizens of any state and as the international global community. Thank you very much.
If anyone from the audience would like to make a question or an intervention, I now open the floor. Yes, please.
I have Yaakov Fogelman. Thank you. I have a few simple questions, I think. One is the term you use, which is rather provocative, the occupied territories. I mean, there was never a Palestinian government here. The British were here. The Jordanians were here. So the only person who might say we're occupying their territory is Jordan. Britain gave up on it. They'll just get the Jews from the side. But simply, I don't think it's a fair term. It's like a term which is anti-Israel and also completely ignores whatever rights the Jews have to their one ancient homeland. All of it. To live there in peace. And to me, it seems like the attitudes on Hebron and so forth are very similar to the Judenrein attitudes of Germany. Second question is, how do you determine who is entitled to some sort of privileges as a human rights defender? We know and we see every day There's people who are simply anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli who come in on the Arab side as human rights defenders. The girl who was unfortunately killed was burning U.S. flags and so forth. This type of personality people sneak in from other places. So it strikes me that, if I understand you correctly, anyone who said, I'm a human rights defender, is entitled to all sorts of protection and to even intervene in the struggle and do things to stop the Arabs from being attacked. And the last thing is that I didn't hear anywhere in your talk any reference to the human rights of the people of Sderot. For 6-7 years that's been going on. Terrorists from Gaza, by a government elected by the citizens of Gaza, with the purpose of destroying Israel, quite proudly, have been doing this. And the groups all, like the terrible scandal in Durban, the allegedly liberal groups all seem to focus on what they think Israel is doing wrong and don't really seem to care a bit about what happens to the Jews. And the Israeli army is the only one who defends their human rights. And that's a bit of it.
Okay, thank you. We'll collect a few statements or questions, and then we'll proceed. Yes, please.
I just would like to say it's a pleasure to attend this event as a delegate of Israel to the UN Commission on Human Rights. I was also participating in the working group of the human rights defenders. What I would like to ask is, the UN had a special work on the high-level experts who were working on the threats and opportunities of the 21st century. And they will be relating to the phenomena of the non-state actors, failed state, and so on. What I see nowadays in the international politics, that we've done a lot, we achieved a lot within this human rights since the 1948 Declaration. But there is a lot of chaotic phenomena that we don't take enough, we don't, cope with that sufficiently. And then we have kind of, chaotic phenomena on behalf of the of non-state actors who abuse the human, in contradiction to the responsibility to protect, we have such a phenomena of abuse of human rights of the civilian and so on. And then we have to cope with the question of the gentleman who was before me. So there is lots of challenges. We are not coping with them sufficiently.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, please. Mr. Greenbaum.
Thank you for a very fine talk. I think that it presents in a very fair way the dilemmas that human rights defenders have and the vulnerability that they have in various parts of the world, and particularly here. I have two questions. One is, how can the work of human rights defenders be made more effective? As we see, even as Yuval mentioned before, the defenders in the occupied territories were not allowed to come. The IDF was not represented here deliberately. This represents a feeling that we're talking among ourselves, people who are interested in human rights all over the world. How can we reach those people who are in some way violating human rights? The other question has to do specifically with children's rights, which I have a particular interest in. And I think that the question here is what I would like to hear from you is, given all the different violations and the different problems having to do with human rights in various parts of the world, how important is our children's rights seen in that context?
On the question of the use of the term occupied territories, I use this term because that is the internationally accepted situation as the international community and the United Nations sees the situation over here, and that's how they define the West Bank and Gaza. I hope that you will take this issue up and convince the international community that there is need for a different terminology to be used. But once that's done, and you have been able to convince the world, we'll comply with that. I can, as a human rights defender, I am working under a framework which is very clear. It is written. It is a framework constructed from the different human rights instruments that have come as a result of collective wisdom of the global community, and to which most states, members of the United Nations, subscribe. And that is my identity also, and it brings me to the next question. How do we say that a certain category of persons must be privileged in any way, like human rights defenders? How do we say that these people must have certain privileges? We don't certify them. Their work certifies them. The legitimacy and relevance of their work to the promotion and protection of human rights certifies them. That is why, as I said, pointed out in my presentation, the Declaration doesn't speak about people. It speaks about the activities in which certain people are involved, and because of their engagement with those activities, which are very well defined in the Declaration, they become people who must enjoy the protections enshrined in the Declaration. I have heard also arguments from time to time that human rights defenders can have different ideologies. We have no ideologies. We are people who are bound to a certain framework. We cannot claim the status of human rights defenders if we are going beyond that framework or out of that framework. So anybody who says, for instance, that I don't recognize the framework is not a human rights defender. They may have, the facts have to be the same. People may interpret facts differently, but they have to apply the same framework. They have to have methodologies of applying the same framework, and therefore subscribing to the same values. Their means may be different. They may have different methods of dealing with things. They may have different mandates which compel them to concentrate on one kind of rights or the other kind of rights. But I find it very difficult to accept, firstly, that human rights framework is a kind of ideology, or that human rights defenders can have different views on human rights which are very clearly framed. You have also mentioned different situations that I didn't mention. Paucity of time is one of the reasons why not every situation that exists can be mentioned. But let me tell you that the concerns of the international community have stretched beyond the practices of the Israeli state. In the context of this region, people have not only expressed concerns. In every resolution of the United Nations Human Rights Commission, for instance, or the General Assembly, there is an equal condemnation of violence, regardless of where it is emanating from. The only reason why sometimes perhaps the state here feels that there is more directed towards them is because they are a state. And there is a certain responsibility of the state and a certain code of conduct for states who are member states of the United Nations, which compels the organization to address the state. Nevertheless, the United Nations, or any one of us as individuals or parts of human rights associations and organizations, have never failed to condemn violence. Never failed to condemn violence. We as human rights defenders are also obliged to defend activities as human rights activities only when they are peaceful.
Zionism is racism. It's a clear UN bias. They find
I mean, these may be your opinions, and I would die protecting your rights to voice them. But at the same time, I think this perhaps is not a question relevant to me as a human rights defender. There may be several opinions within this region in the context of what's happening here. Everybody has the right to voice those opinions, and everybody has the right to convince others with regard to the weight of their opinions and to show the way forward. This is what the whole world wants, and I hope that there will be more opportunity here without discrimination to allow that freedom of expression. Coupled with that freedom is the freedom of movement and the freedom to, and the right to dignity, to human dignity. One of the questions came with regard to the phenomenon of non-state actors. Yes, you're right. I agree with you that the international human rights framework, it's not that they don't address this phenomenon. The enforcement mechanisms provided by the framework are weak. And it is, in fact, perhaps the result, I think it's perhaps the result of the unwillingness of the states to recognize that they have a duty to deal with non-state actors when violations occur. It is a clear principle in my mind, and I'm sure it is shared by other human rights defenders here, that non-state actors must be held accountable. The process through which this accountability is to be enforced is a process which states must fulfill. You're also right that there are newer challenges that are emerging. But let me tell you that the international human rights framework, coupled with the international humanitarian law framework, is not unequal to coping with those challenges. People have studied these, people have analyzed it, not because we have any kind of a instinct to preserve the framework as it is. We are the ones actually who always point towards more and more need. But I can tell you that this is a preoccupation with many people in my field who have tested this framework. And we find that it is adequate. It needs better mechanisms so that its application can result from broader interpretations of the existing framework. Many of the times, at least in my experience, it's not that there is a lack of standards. The problem always is that there is a lack of will and a hesitation to apply those to situations that can be brought within that framework and can be interpreted in a manner in which it would be very appropriate to apply those standards in certain situations. How can work of human rights defenders be made more effective? You're very right that human rights defenders' work is not dependent on international declarations alone. They are very much dependent on the will of the state and the civil society to enforce and implement what international instruments say. First thing, of course, is for governments not just to recognize the legitimacy and value of human rights work and to construct policies and legislations and mechanisms that will enhance and reflect their commitment of this towards this recognition. Secondly, of course there are gray areas. Of course there are questions. There must be opportunity for dialogue, where people can convince each other, people can show each other the way forward. And if there is absence of one actor or the other, comprehensive dialogue cannot be had. It is precisely for this reason that we use the word facilitate the defense of human rights. Any policy that is lacking in that commitment to facilitate any action of non-government, of state or non-government actors, non-state actors, that does not cater for concrete measures towards this facilitation, I think will always create a situation where we will be continuously arguing, but will not find or have a consensus on what are the rules of engagement, on what are the standards that apply to these situations. So I agree with you that we have to make an effort to make human rights defenders' work more effective by protecting human rights defenders themselves. Human rights cannot be promoted in the air or in a vacuum. It takes people to do so. And if those people are threatened day in and day out, I tell you that it is one of the most unfortunate things that I see in my part of the world, in several other countries as well, where human rights defenders are so threatened and are at such grave risks that people like the front line have to make arrangements to lift these people out of their countries. Many human rights defenders are living in exile. It is enough that these people are facing situations which are not healthy for them as persons, as members of the families that they have to leave behind. It is also extremely damaging to our efforts to promote and protect human rights, because we have a handful of people who are engaged in this activity. When people have to leave, this depletes human rights communities in the countries and weakens our efforts. So I do believe that there is much more to be done, and that's why I said the declaration is just the beginning. We have a long way to go. Rights of children, I think it's absolutely essential. And in the global context, this must be one of the most important section of the population. In my country, 53% of the population is children, which means out of 160 million people, more than half are children. Imagine a country that does not spend more than 2% of its GDP on education. How much of a priority is it giving to children's rights? And it's the situation in many other countries. Children are today at peril because of the very situations that we are talking about. The number of children used in armed conflict is increasing every day. That is why the United Nations had to create a special representative on children in armed conflict, because it is a matter of concern and a matter of priority. Yet, I think individual governments are not giving enough attention to this. I see that in the human rights defenders community, defenders working on child rights is increasing every day. So I do see that as a positive sign that more priority is going to be given.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Jilani, for very insightful and thought-provoking presentation. I want to say again, we appreciate enormously the effort you made in coming here. I also want to voice my personal opinion about the utter importance of this exercise for our society. The fact that we have someone with this kind of experience come here and share it with us, and the fact that you put a certain mirror against us. I think it's whether we agree with everything or disagree with some things, I think it's immensely valuable for us, and I'm very grateful for you to come and also for our friends from Frontline. And so I thank you very much for coming, and I thank again the people who has helped organizing this, the Norwegian Embassy, the people in Minerva, and I wish you all the best.